All right, earlier this year, as Moscow launched its full-scale invasion into Ukraine, President Volodymyr Zelensky accused Russian forces of using phosphorus bombs during a wave of attacks. In a stunning interview, our Holly Williams sat down with an American who volunteered to fight on the front lines in Ukraine. He shared his harrowing encounter with white phosphorus bombs.
It comes down extremely slow, but there's nothing you can do, and everything it touches just incinerates. Probably about 20 or 30 guys burning alive, and several gunshots, because there's nothing else they do. So a lot of guys have suicide pistols, and you'd hear them scream, and then they would say goodbye.
Joining us now is John Parachini. He's a senior international defense researcher with the RAND Corporation. Thanks so much for joining us, sir.
Glad to be with you this morning.
So can you explain in more detail to our audience what exactly is white phosphorus and why has it been used as a weapon of war?
White phosphorus is a kind of a waxy-like material that, when exposed to oxygen, reaches a temperature of about 1,500 degrees. It typically has been used as a way to hide troops. It creates a white smoke, and so that's really its historic purpose. In recent years, it's been used essentially as a way to incinerate everything below it, and it's, as the individual who you just interviewed referred it, as an incredibly deadly material when it lands on the ground. The Russians used it on Snake Island essentially to burn a piece of territory that they left, and the United States has used it at different times in 2017 on ISIS in Iraq and Syria, essentially to incinerate where they may have had a chemical weapons lab.
Can you give us some more detail? We heard from that soldier, that volunteer fighter who's an American fighting in Ukraine, his firsthand account of seeing human beings under attack from white phosphorus. But how does the chemical affect human beings? I mean, we know that it burns. And can you take shelter from it before being affected? I mean, presumably you can see it coming, and would there be an opportunity to take cover or shelter if you can?
Well, you would certainly want to try and do that, but a material that burns at this high heat can burn through metal. So the places where you could take cover are likely not going to be cover for very long.
That is horrific to know that if it can burn through metals, clearly, as we see here in this quote, what hope does human flesh have? So this use of white phosphorus is banned under the Geneva Conventions. And I think for most people who are watching this and who are learning about these atrocities and these kinds of weapons that are being used in a theater of war, they're going to say, what is the purpose of having laws like this on the books, laws that all nations are supposed to adhere to, if the Russians allegedly can flaunt them?
Well, this is a legitimate weapon when used against military forces. Under the Convention on Conventional Weapons, it is restricted on its use against civilians. Any type of weaponry that's used to kill people is always terrible. Let's be clear about that. There are no good weapons, if indeed you're the victim of them. This is a particularly heinous one. Its original intent was, in its production, was to create cover for troops, white smoke for troops to move behind. But in recent years, it really has been used as a way to burn everything that falls below it.
So, John, I stand corrected. It is not banned under Geneva Conventions, but it's tightly regulated, I understand, under international law. So the question is, why not close those loopholes that allow a chemical weapon like this to be used under the Chemical Weapons Convention?
Excellent question. It is not banned under the Chemical Weapons Convention because it doesn't have toxic properties, which is really where the types of materials that the Chemical Weapons Convention is designed to cover. If it were used for its toxic properties, then it might be covered under the general purpose criterion of the Chemical Weapons Convention. But it is covered under the Convention on Conventional Weapons. And here, I think you ask a perfectly legitimate question. Is it such a heinous type of weapon and kills in such a terrible way that maybe it ought to be included specifically, even in its use against troops? That, I think, is an issue for a negotiation at some point here in the future. It would be a tough one because it's widely available and it's been widely used by many different militaries around the globe. And when you think about the different ways that weaponry is used, this is just one. There are many terrible ways to kill people, and this is certainly one of them.
You're sadly right about that. And before we go, I wonder too, when we look at, for example, the firebombing by the Allies of Dresden and other places in Nazi Germany during World War II, when we look at the use of Agent Orange during the Vietnam War and other types of conflicts where horrible, horrific weapons have been used against our fellow men and women, it does, it's hard to sort of qualify, whoa, that's okay. In the case of Dresden, or in the case of dropping 2 nuclear weapons on Japan, and this is not. Is there a way to distinguish between these horrific acts of war?
Yeah, the real distinction that exists heretofore is about weaponry used against military forces as opposed to civilians. The tragic thing about the Russian invasion of Ukraine is that they have used all sorts of weaponry against civilians, and specifically so. They haven't just really been attacking Ukrainian military forces. As we saw last week, they launched drones to all sorts of civilian areas, hospitals, schools, playgrounds, apartment buildings. And as we've seen, as they've retreated from different villages, they've engaged in all sorts of heinous acts against civilians. So that really is the distinction, the use of weaponry against military forces versus civilians. And in the case of this current tragic conflict, the Russians have certainly been in violation of it.
It's an important distinction, and I'm certainly glad that you made it for us, John. Thank you very, very much. We appreciate it.
Good to be with you.